From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello there.
I hope you're all charged up for this episode.
Yes.
You'll know what I'm talking about in a second. And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is a great show because it shows the demise of the nuclear power nightmare and the rise of solar energy.
Well, you've just given away my entire opening, Ralph.
That's all right. It bears repeating.
It does. It does. The theme, as Ralph said, the theme of today's show is energy, the good kind and the bad kind. And the good kind is solar. We will be talking to longtime solar power expert Scott Sklar, who, in addition to being a leader in the field, put his money where his mouth was by designing and building his own zero-energy home and office using a whole array of solar energy technologies. We're going to hear all about that. We're also going to talk about the bad kind of energy, nuclear power. This is a theme we have hit in a number of occasions with guests such as former head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, David Freeman, and former Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner Peter Bradford, as well as with filmmaker Ivy Mearpole. And today we find yet another angle on this issue with Paul Gunter, who is one of the directors of the group Beyond Nuclear. As always, we will hear the latest from Russell Mokhiber, the Horatio Caine of corporate crime beat, for all of you CSI Miami fans out there. Ralph has some comments he wants to make on a couple of topics at the end of the show. And we also will, in at least the podcast version, have Maria Maesto, who was advocating for adjunct professors, answer a couple of listener questions. But let's kick things off today by finding out what lies beyond nuclear. David?
Paul Gunter is an environmental activist and energy policy analyst who has been an ardent critic of atomic power development for more than 40 years. In 1976, Mr. Gunter helped launch the anti-nuclear movement as co-founder of the Clamshell Alliance, which through nonviolent direct action fought the construction of New Hampshire's Seabrook nuclear power plant. Today, he's the director and lead spokesperson in nuclear reactor hazards and security concerns for the group Beyond Nuclear, which aims to educate and activate the public about the connections between nuclear power and nuclear weapons and the need to abandon both to safeguard our future. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Paul Gunter.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Welcome, Paul. I started fighting nuclear power probably a little bit earlier than you in the early 1970s when I joined with Henry Kendall and Dan Ford, who were the precursors for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and challenging the economics and hazards of nuclear power. And over the years, I've been able to summarize it this way. Nuclear power is unnecessary, unsafe, uninsurable, unguardable, unable to get private commercial financing without a guarantee from the taxpayer, and unyielding in its drive to continue surviving in an era of rising solar energy and efficiency by enormous lobbying in Congress, basically the corporate state in action. And all these members of Congress who say they're conservatives and they don't believe in government subsidies and crony capitalism somehow make an exception for nuclear power. So let's start with the first one, Paul. Nuclear power is unnecessary.
Well, I think that you can go all the way back to 1952, Ralph, with the Paley Commission under the Truman administration when they first adopted this committee to look into the development of solar power under the Truman administration. Of course, we know that, Paley's commission recommended that we, as a nation, could develop energy independence through solar power, and also projected how we could do it through synthetic oil. But that was overridden by the Atomic Energy Act, subsequently rephrased as the peaceful atom, which in fact never was. It was always, as the old bumper sticker said, the peaceful atom is a bomb. And in fact, that began the proliferation and the spread of nuclear weapons material, including some of the early arrangements through the Peaceful Atom Program that led to the transfer of nuclear technology to Iran in 1954, where they were able to receive the technology, enriched uranium, and began the production of plutonium way back then. So, in fact, what happened was that truly sustainable independent energy policy was stymied back in the 1950s in favor of what was published as dual-purpose reactors to co-generate plutonium for military applications in nuclear weapons development, and using the waste heat from that weapons production process to co-generate electricity for commercial use. And that was published in an early white paper through the Atomic Energy Commission and really exposed the hypocrisy of the peaceful atom at the very beginning.
At the time, Paul, you remember, at the time, we were told that nuclear power is going to be too cheap to meter. And we now have less than 100 nuclear plants. A number of them have closed down. There are some nuclear plants that were supposed to be built, and they have been shut and stopped because it's too expensive. A few are still being, I guess, built in the South, maybe Georgia, hanging on by the taxpayers' fingernails, demanding more and more subsidies as the costs skyrocket. And Governor Cuomo is one of governors who are responding to bailing out some nuclear reactors in upstate New York at the same time that he is supporting the shutdown of Indian Point reactors, two of them 30 miles north of Manhattan in New York City on the Hudson River. A disaster there could be beyond catastrophic, much worse than Fukushima disaster in Japan. So we're dealing here with basically a time bomb. There have been near misses in the past, the Fermi reactor in Michigan near Detroit, where an engineer was heard to say, quote, "We almost lost Detroit," end quote. Listeners might want to know, if they don't, that there's huge amount of radioactive gases inside a nuclear plant, 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant. Why don't you tell our listeners, Paul Gunter of Beyond Nuclear, the panorama of hazards from nuclear plants, from the mining to the plant to the search for a radioactive waste disposal dump for the next couple 100,000 years. Why don't you give a panorama on that?
Well, you know, the nuclear industry and its champions like to refer to it as the nuclear energy cycle, but in fact, it's a nuclear chain that binds our future generations to nuclear weapons and nuclear waste. Uranium has always been the currency of a coin whose flip sides are nuclear waste and nuclear weapons. And every link in this chain has been breaking down, beginning with the examples of uranium mining, largely on indigenous peoples' lands, where the bottom line has left literally mountains of uranium mine tailings, which, again, uranium is not only radioactive, but it is also heavy metal and as poisonous as lead. And so these communities have been, at the very beginning of the nuclear chain, the victims of water pollution, air pollution, and the American Indians, the Navajo, for example, who have been involved in these mining operations, they have been shortchanged in their public health care from exposing themselves to this inherently dangerous mining process.
Dying from it, too.
Absolutely. And you know, not only dying from the radioactivity, but dying from the exposure to the heavy metals, and then bringing that poison back into their homes. But it's not just the radioactivity or the heavy metals, but I think that this industry's been uncanny in its ability to re-image itself. And where originally they got started with this whole notion that it would be too cheap to meter, they have transformed that image after it became obviously too costly to matter, where over half, or roughly half, of the nuclear projects that were started in the United States were canceled during construction or subsequently abandoned because of the inherent uneconomical nature of nuclear power, where they have historically shown to be unable to meet cost of completion and time to completion. And as a result, a good example, the Seabrook nuclear power plant, where I got started in my opposition back in 1975. Back then it was offered at $450 million per unit for 2 units, $900 million. By the time that project got started, despite our opposition through nonviolent direct action and occupation of the site, Unit 1 was ultimately finished in 1990 at a cost of over $6.7 billion, and the Unit 2 had been canceled with a sunk cost of $900 million.
Well, that's why Wall Street doesn't want to fund it without a Washington-provoked taxpayer guarantee. This is a government-guaranteed industry, but the good news is that it's in the process of shutting down, contrary to the propaganda of the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry always wants to sell nuclear power, saying the alternative is dirty coal. The alternative is energy efficiency. The alternative is solar energy, which have huge opportunities to make our economy far more efficient, less polluting, and more safe for future generations. But from the mines, you go to the spent fuel rods in the nuclear plant. Give a few observations on the hazards there that your group Beyond Nuclear has been documenting. And then briefly on there's no radioactive waste dump yet in the United States. It's all being parked next to these dozens of nuclear plants and spent fuel rods. Very dangerous for potential sabotage, by the way. Go ahead.
Well, again, as they have re-imaged themselves, now they've been discovered to be the most expensive way to boil water for generating electricity. And it's not unlike being as unsustainable as burning antiques in your wood stove. It just doesn't work. So they have now gone to this new image of being a clean air energy source with what they're calling zero emissions credits as the new scam that is being advanced to bilk state ratepayers and citizens. We've already seen Illinois and New York pass legislation for these zero energy credits, which, completely put blinders on carbon emissions in this reframing that the industry is now going through.
Like it's a savior on climate change.
It's a total hoax.
Yeah. They don't mention, by the way, all the coal burning necessary to enrich the uranium to begin with.
The front end of the nuclear chain is incredibly carbon intensive. So enrichment, mining, milling, fuel fabrication are intensely carbon emissions. We've seen some studies by Benjamin Sarvicol, for example, where carbon from coal facilities is upwards of 750 to 1,000 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. While it's true that coal is the biggest, nuclear is really the second. And while much less, we've seen studies of the fuel chain where it's roughly on average of 60 grams per kilowatt hour to upwards of 200 grams per kilowatt hour, largely again from that fuel chain. But when you look at the renewable energy contribution, we're down to 3 grams to 8 grams per kilowatt hour coming from offshore and terrestrial-based land. So
yeah, we're going to be talking about with Scott Sklar. Right now, I'd like you to talk about the hazards. Let's just talk about the hazards from the existing nuclear power plants, which, by the way, provide, about 20% of the electricity in the country now?
It's down to about 19% now.
Right,
We had 99 operating reactors in the United States. 6 is closed within the last 5 years, but we could be seeing more than a dozen reactors close in the next 5 years. But again, it's this struggle that the industry's now lobbying for these zero energy credits. But in fact, that's a complete lie. You have to discount the fact that each and every one of these nuclear power stations is emitting radioactivity, again, through this entire fuel chain, but even through the nuclear power plants, while they don't have smokestacks, they are emitting a whole host, up to 124 different radioactive isotopes on a routine level. Radioactive tritium, which is essentially radioactive, it's a third isotope of hydrogen. This radioactivity, while short-lived, since it's hydrogen, radioactive hydrogen, it can incorporate itself at the most intimate level of our biology, right down to the DNA. And when it displaces stable hydrogen, it then is a known carcinogenic. It causes birth defects. It causes genetic mutations. And this is essentially an unregulated release into the atmosphere and into the water. But again, this is just one.
Well, just to interject here, the Patsy Nuclear Regulatory Commission in Washington is supposed to regulate. They will not, and they've refused over the years, report to the public living around these nuclear plants what the level of emissions are. You cite a 2012 analysis of multiple studies in Europe that revealed the statistically significant 37% increase in child leukemia within 3 miles of nuclear power plants. Now, the evacuation range, what other source of energy requires an evacuation plan? And nuclear power plants have never had an evacuation drill, like buildings have a fire drill, because they thought it would alarm the public. But if you see Indian Point, 30 miles north of New York City, they have never had an evacuation plan because you can't evacuate. You can hardly evacuate New York City in rush hour. Imagine if there is a beginning of a meltdown in a nuclear plant, and this is near an relatively active earthquake fault in the 2 Indian Point plants. Imagine trying to evacuate New York City. That's why even Hillary Clinton, not just Andrew Cuomo, the president governor, years ago called for its shutdown. It's scheduled to shut down now in about 4 or 5 years, but you never know. You never know how they try to slither out of it. And,
right, this is what happened in Illinois and Fitzpatrick. Those plants were scheduled for shutdown because they were racking up hundreds of millions of dollars of lost revenue because these facilities, largely on now, they're 40 to 50 years old. They're antiquated designs. But rather than shut them down, what they did was they maneuvered their political prowess to provide, again, for these zero energy credits. But, when you look at the accident consequences, the Chernobyl accident in Ukraine has had environmental consequences causing food bans as far away as the United Kingdom. There are still food bans throughout Europe because of the radioactive cesium that fell in the radioactive clouds and the rain of radioactive materials that followed that accident. And still vast areas of land are now still exclusion zones that, in fact, according to the National Geographic, are only growing larger by the fact that fires now on these abandoned lands are spreading the radioactivity. We have a study that's just out by Dr. Mousseau with the biology department at the University of South Carolina, who has gone there into the Chernobyl zone and identified that the whole biological network for the causing of forest material to decay has diminished or disappeared. So forest leaves and logs, they're not decaying. This is sort of like a zombie forest. that then just adds to the fuel of these fires and the spread of the radioactivity, causing these exclusion zones to get bigger.
More than that, as I pointed out in my book, Animal Envy, there are radioactive mammals, there are radioactive birds that spread beyond the abandoned and cordoned off thousands of square kilometers, including villages and towns that are now completely abandoned with homes, empty and being inhabited by all kinds of insects and animals. So, one thing that really impressed me about Beyond Nuclear, Paul Gunter, was just recently you put out a report called Framing the Anti-Nuclear Message Using Welsh Values, a handbook for activists. You all went to Wales in England because, unfortunately, the British are gung-ho now to build more nuclear power plants instead of taking advantage of solar and wind power and efficiency. And they're thinking of building nuclear plants in Wales. And I was impressed because of the way you adapted accurately the language to the culture of the people who live in Wales. Can you talk about that and tell our listeners how they can get this report?
Well, it's available on our website, beyondnuclear.org. But I think that, uniquely we have to be reaching out to the various cultures. Wales is largely still devoted to agriculture. And some of the biggest threats to agriculture now come from putting nuclear facilities in that will threaten the development of prime livelihoods and resources. It also jeopardizes both ground and surface water. The good news there is that, we now, as this nuclear industry is in demise, I think most dramatically demonstrated by the bankruptcy of Westinghouse Electric Company, which is the largest manufacturer and supplier of nuclear power plants and supplies. Their bankruptcy has thrown that whole program into doubt, as well as further casting doubt on the completion of new reactors here in the United States. But the impacts of nuclear power are far-reaching in terms of, their cultural impacts. Look at Japan, for example. Japan prides itself on generation upon generation being rooted in its ancestral lands. And now we have an area the size of Connecticut in Japan that is contaminated well beyond the international radiation protection standards. And the only way that the Japanese government on an island where land is in high regard was to go from the international standard for evacuating populations from 1 millisievert per year. They raised it to 20 millisieverts per year. So 20 times the amount of the international standard is now the permissible level, which the Japanese government is now forcing people that had both voluntarily evacuated or were ordered to evacuate it, and in the meantime given financial compensation for being dislocated from their properties. The government is removing that subsidy to protect them and essentially involving them in a forced relocation back onto these contaminated
including
lands.
the children.
Absolutely.
That was just reported in the press. We're talking about Fukushima, listeners, and the earthquake, the tsunami, the enormous radioactivity still leaking into the Pacific, going right across the Pacific, contaminating aquatic life. And the Japanese are reopening the ones that were remote from Fukushima and were shut down. So this is a dying industry that refuses to go away because it's corporate socialism. It's government guarantee. And they've got all these lobbyists swarming all over the place. I thought Amory Lovins, Paul Gunter, had the best fundamental answer to people who say, we have to have all of the above. We have to have solar, energy conservation, nuclear, coal, gas, oil, geothermal. And Amory Lovins said, no, they're not all the same in terms of cost to the consumer in terms of environmental damage, in terms of government guarantees, in terms of lack of insurability. If a disaster occurs, the taxpayer picks up the tab. And what he said was, look, if a new nuclear plant comes in at $12 billion, the same $12 billion can be invested in retrofitting homes and buildings and creating jobs for energy efficiency and solar energy and getting huge more energy per buck than the disastrous nuclear power. And so that's the ultimate attack that's irrebuttable in terms of investment.
It's the most readily implementable on the time scale. We have to look at the time scale now to address climate change as the big crisis. Nuclear power, which is known for its inability to build on time, is going to sabotage our efforts. The most recent nuclear power station built and completed in the United States was Watts Bar Unit 2. It was ordered in 1973. It took 43 years to build and license a nuclear power station that has a 40-year license. And in the first year of its operation, it has been shut down for months. So if you were looking for a way to sabotage a 21st century energy policy to address climate change, you would redirect our resources and what precious little time we have left back into this known demonstrated loser. Energy efficiency is, in fact, the most important strategy to reduce emissions in the electric power sector.
By far.
By far. And it avoids emissions of greenhouse gases and other harmful pollutants, but energy efficiency can substantially reduce carbon pollution. And in fact, our 21st century energy policy, before even thinking about building new power plants, we should be maxing out the energy efficiency that can be put in there by, reintroducing energy efficiency upgrades to commercial buildings, residential homes. Then that's going to build way more jobs. The NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, just put out a study that showed that we could be creating 77,000 jobs annually over the next decade and boost the economy by billions of dollars just by encouraging smart energy use in commercial buildings.
Yeah, and we have a president now that wants to try to resurrect the dying coal industry and continue subsidies to nuclear power. So you can see the gap between reason, science, engineering, economics, the American people, and those who rule us has never been greater on the energy scene. And why do you think the nuclear power lobbyists and spokespeople are afraid to debate people like you, Amory Lovins, the former commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Peter Bradford? You don't get them willing to debate you all, do you?
No, they avoid it. And in fact, it's because the facts of the matter are undisputable. The renewable energy revolution is now unstoppable. The American Wind Energy Association just announced that the first quarter of 2017, we've installed 2,000 megawatts of new terrestrial-based wind turbine energy. This is essentially the strongest start in 8 years now. But right now, there's 84,000 megawatts of land-based wind power that's going to grow to about 120,000 megawatts in the next 4 years.
And for people who don't resonate with all that technical stuff, Paul, 84,000 megawatts are equivalent to 84 nuclear plants. 84
Absolutely.
Nuclear plants. So, listen, we're running out of time, and we're going to segue right into the whole sunshine world of solar energy with one of the country's greatest experts, Scott Sklar. So before we close, Paul Gunter, tell the listeners how they can reach you and get more information.
Well, we have a whole host of information in pamphlet form, but our website is the most current, and that's, again, beyondnuclear.org. You can go to our Facebook page, and through there you can get hold of our weekly bulletin. that is both promoting renewable energy efficiency and conservation and raising the issues that continue to surround the demise of nuclear power. But let me just add, Ralph, that now is the most dangerous time as the profit motive is lost on nuclear power. The industry itself now is embarking upon cutting its operational costs by 30%. This means less inspections, less maintenance and repairs. At the same time, we see the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, as there are no new orders for new nuclear plants, they are also reducing their staff. Both these trends are converging on the next nuclear accident. And that's why we need to, as the old saying goes, we are better active today than radioactive tomorrow.
And not only that, but people should know that there was almost a disaster at Browns Ferry years ago in Alabama. There was, of course, the disaster at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. This is an industry that has only one bite of the apple. So thank you very much, Paul Gunter. And now you can see the bright spots coming up, the burgeoning global wind power, solar power industry that is replacing the old forms of energy on economic grounds, not just on geopolitical and environmental grounds. Thank you very much, Paul Gunter.
And thank you, Ralph, for all your work.
We've been speaking to Paul Gunter of Beyond Nuclear. We will link to that important organization at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's take a quick break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 26, 2017. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Even after Volkswagen pled guilty to a 9-year conspiracy to dupe regulators and consumers, the car maker has continued to insist that top executives played no role in the emissions fraud, but internal company emails and memos, which were reviewed by the New York Times, indicate that engineers wanted approval from top managers to deploy the illegal software almost from the beginning, with regular status reports noting that high-level sign-off was necessary. The emissions issue was the main agenda for a 2007 meeting attended by Matthias Mueller, the current chief executive, who was then Volkswagen's head of product planning, as well as by Martin Winterkorn, the chief executive at the time. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Now that we've dealt with the type of energy we need to get rid of, let's turn our attention to the kind of energy we need to encourage. And here to tell us all about that is our next guest, David.
Scott Sklar is an internationally recognized solar energy leader. He served as executive director of the Solar Energy Industries Association, as political director of the Solar Lobby, and in the mid-1970s, he co-founded the Congressional Solar Caucus. He also co-authored the Consumer Guide to Solar Energy. Currently, Mr. Sklar leads his own clean energy technology optimization and strategic policy firm known as the Stella Group, and also designed and built his own zero-energy home and office, which incorporates an array of solar energy technologies. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Scott Sklar.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, you might also want to know, readers, that he is the author of the Consumer's Guide to Solar Energy, and he has done it all in solar energy for 4 decades or more, starting as an assistant to Senator Jacob Javits in the Senate. And then there's no stopping Scott Sklar when it comes to solar. He ran the Solar Energy Trade Association, and he's been on all kinds of groups, fomenting, galvanizing. And recently, Scott, you rebutted, under the title of Renewable Energy World, you rebutted President Trump's pretense and energy plan, and now we have the energy cuts by the Trump budget. He's cutting climate change research, he's cutting research on renewable energy and energy conservation, while he keeps his subsidies for nuclear power and tries to tout coal. So tell us how fast the energy efficiency movement and the solar movement is growing in terms of jobs and megawatts, and how fast the price is declining, putting coal incrementally right out of business.
Well, absolutely correct. I mean, if you take a look at how many people are just involved in energy efficiency, and here we're just talking about the efficiency side, reducing energy use. And I want to remind people it is always less expensive to save energy than generate from any source. We have 2.2 million Americans employed in that. And then we have the renewable side, the renewable energy generation. And for solar alone, we have 260,000 plus workers. We've been rising faster than the economy, increased by 10 times faster than the overall economy. And, and it's growing. And it's growing in every state where, for instance, the coal industry is really in 6 states and employs less people than the retail chain IKEA. So Mr. Trump really is sort of looking backwards, trying to preserve dial phones and adding machines rather than drive cellular and computing, but now in energy. And that's really the conundrum we have right now in national policy.
What struck me with your statement is you said in 2015, 94 coal-fired power plants closed down, and another 41 coal plants are closed down in 2016, and the other coal plants are aging. And so as the coal plants recede, and I'm telling you, there are far more jobs in West Virginia for solar panel installations than there are in the coal industry in the coming decades, to pick one of the coal-producing states. Compare, Scott Sklar, the amount of workers directly employed by the clean energy industry, which, as you say, includes the energy efficiency, smart grid, energy storage industries, electric power generation from the entire portfolio of renewable energy.
Yeah, well, that's 3,384,834 Americans at last count, and the entire fossil industry is barely 3 million, and of course they've been around for over 100 years. So the point is, what makes this so dramatic, Ralph, since you and I started tracking all this 40 years ago, is that we have overtaken in the last 5 years the fossil industry, and we are growing faster, and will continue to do that.
An amazing thing is when you get to energy conservation, retrofitting buildings, etc., you cite an official report that says, quote, energy efficiency industry directly employed nearly 2.2 million Americans in its green appliance and green building subsectors. And you also say the energy efficiency sector predicts a job growth rate of 9 to 11% for 2017. These are fairly good paying jobs. They can't be exported to Mexico and China. And what we're seeing here is every time Donald Trump opens his mouth and says we're going to get more coal miners jobs and we're going to expand the coal industry and gets huge media, there's hardly any rebuttal given through the mass media, the figures we've just recounted for our listeners. How do we get this story across? Because it's pretty stunning. It's not only that energy efficiency and solar energy, wind power are overtaking the job levels of fossil fuels and nuclear power, but they're overtaking it at an accelerating rate, and the same thing is happening over most of the world. Amory Lovins pointed out a few years ago that solar and wind is beating the pants off new generating capacity from fossil fuels, for example, on cost basis alone, never mind all the pollution costs.
Absolutely, and I want to point out that in the last 4 years in the United States of America and the last 3 years globally, renewable energy has brought on more electricity for new electric power generation than fossil fuel or nuclear. So these last 5 years has been a dramatic change in how the world is turning to clean energy, and there are several drivers for it. One, of course, is the cost going down, in that you can, surely for wind, and in at least half the case for solar photovoltaics, we can beat out a conventional power plant, and on cost alone. if you sit down with the financial people and they're deciding whether they want to put their money in a coal plant or renewable plant, they're saying, well, wait a second. We have a set of technologies with absolutely no waste. Why would we want to worry about an investment that's going to have a massive amount of waste? And lastly, clean water. Most of the generation in the world, historically and today, uses steam to turn generators. Only 3% of our water is clean, and energy actually uses more water than agriculture. And it is not sustainable. So we need to get off of sucking up clean water to create steam, by the way, which most does not get replenished back to the rivers or the lakes, but actually goes in the atmosphere. So wind, solar, marine technology, tidal and wave, many kinds of geothermal do not use clean water.
The nice thing about all this is that solar is very decentralized, right down to your home roof, your school roof, and it's not like coal and oil and gas, which are ripping up the terrain and strip mining, poisoning streams and groundwater. They're concentrated in certain areas. So this is much more egalitarian growth to the economy. How many homes do you think now? I'm told, Scott Sklar, that this is one of the burgeoning industries now in the South and in California. That is, the price of solar panels, thanks to the Chinese exporting very, very cheap solar panels. They've driven out some domestic solar energy industries as a result, but they've dropped the price so that now the U.S. companies are focusing on installation. Can you give us a sense there?
Well, first of all, we have 29 states, over half, that have renewable energy portfolio standards, which means that they have told their utilities that they expect for new generation to have a certain mixture of clean energy in the pool. And that's all the renewables. It's solar photovoltaics, it's concentrated solar, it's wind, it's geothermal, and now states are also creating requirements for battery storage, which is particularly good for wind and solar, which are more variable. And what you're seeing is that it's driving down costs to consumers because it's not just the technology. It's creating a delivery mechanism, a distribution network to the consumer, and an installation and service network. You need a certain amount of concentration. And so in these 29 states, through these renewable portfolio standards, we're seeing that concentration. And by the way, it's not just California. I mean, Texas has more wind right now, and 2 cents a kilowatt hour coming out of them. You can't build a gas plant for that. New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, Georgia has a portfolio standard and bringing in hundreds of megawatts for solar. So it's not just these blue states, it's red states as well.
Listeners, listen to a quote from Scott Sklar's press release challenging President Trump's executive order, which basically says more coal, more fossil fuels, less research on renewables and climate change. And I'm quoting, quote, Trump's executive order should be no surprise, as other outlets have reported, that nearly one-third of the Trump team has ties to the Koch brothers and Koch Industries, the very same players that have paid front groups to fight state renewable energy portfolio standards and solar net metering, end quote. I'm told that the Koch brothers are pouring money into southern legislatures to impose a tax on solar panels, and they're losing, because Republicans and Democrats in these legislatures are saying, hey, this is good business, these solar panel installation firms, etc., and they're resisting even the powerful Koch brothers' lobbying efforts. So is this true?
Yes.
In other words...
yes, it's true. And they have created front groups to question climate change as well, and sending out videos to school teachers questioning climate change. So there's this whole network to undermine this clean evolution. But listen, during the national election where Trump won in Florida, we defeated a fake amendment which basically would say the only way you can have solar is if it's from the electric utility. Not only did we defeat the amendment, but we did it with a coalition of the solar industry, the environmental movement, the young Republicans, and a whole range, the Tea Party, the Christian Coalition. So this was a left to progressive to conservative side, all supporting the same thing, that we do not want monopolies. We want access by everyone to distributed energy, and if we want it clean, that is our right. And if we can do it less expensive for families, which is why the Christian Coalition came in, we should have that right. We should not have government-sanctioned monopolies and these backroom corporations deciding what our energy choices are.
And the nice thing about this is it's really a left-right alliance because, listen, when you get down to where people live, work, and raise their families, this conservative-liberal divide disappears. I mean, regardless of their ideology, they want clean energy. They want energy that cuts their utility bills. They don't want to breathe dirty air or contaminated water. And the beauty of this is that what's happening back home at the grassroots and at the state legislative level even is slowing down the marauding institutional insanity that's coming out of Congress, Republican-dominated Congress, and the White House. I mean, they're almost like fossils themselves in terms of being out of date as to what's happening.
Absolutely right. And the point is, we do have some members of Congress from both parties who understand the job creation potential. By the way, Senator Grassley from Iowa, Republican, lead player, has said, hey, we are not backing out of wind. It's a major driver in the Midwestern economy. We're not going to let that happen. And that's what we're beginning to see now, is we're employing enough people that we have enough economic power that it's going to slow down the status quo types who want to take America back to when we had smog in our cities and fires in our rivers. It's not acceptable in the 21st century.
We should emphasize, Scott Sklar, that there are a lot of big companies that have gone big time on energy efficiency, planning for renewables, companies out of Silicon Valley, companies like 3M and IBM and others. It's not just the people, it's not just small business. All these companies want to cut their costs, they want to cut their risks of environmental disasters. The insurance companies...
And they want to increase predictability. The nice thing I want to say is, if there's a riot in Africa on uranium mines, uranium goes up, right? Yeah. And so we have these globalized commodities, coal and oil and uranium, and they're impacted by factors beyond our control.
Not to mention oil, right? Geopolitical wars
oil,
over
of course,
oil.
Right. And so, but the sunlight, the wind, the geothermal underground, it's not accessible by global unpredictability. And so you have huge corporations like Apple and Google, and even Walmart is one of the biggest, and Best Buy are the biggest buyers of solar, rooftop solar in the United States of America, and demand it when they move into states, that they have access, they have net metering, they want to do it. And these big buyers have helped driven down the costs of solar and other renewable energy sources, and they've been a vital player in that.
Well, let's talk about the main argument now you see in the Wall Street Journal and the Manhattan Institute, the corporate-funded Manhattan Institute in New York, a right-wing think tank. Their main argument is, okay, solar's okay, wind power, but it can never quantitatively amount to much. And they've had so many op-eds and editorials in the Wall Street Journal on this nonsense. Can you rebut that when they say, well, it might give us 5%, 6% of our energy, but it just can't scale up enough?
Well, first, as I mentioned earlier in the show, in the last 5 years in the United States, more of new electricity coming online, over 50% has been renewables, and then natural gas has been the next player, and negligible coal or nuclear. That's going to continue, and it's growing at a rate that's making great inroads. But I also teach 2 interdisciplinary courses in sustainable energy at the George Washington University, and I hand my students 33 studies which show in aggregate that with technology we have today, using the entire portfolio of high-value energy efficiency, renewable energy, and energy storage, we can technically and economically meet all of our energy needs with these resources. We have the state of Hawaii and the state of Vermont that's agreed to go 100% renewable energy. We have numerous cities in the United States moving in that direction. And once these happen, it will be psychologically profound. It's going to change the market because then they don't have to import fuels. They don't have to worry about cleaning up coal ash spills and brownfield sites. And once that happens, it's going to be a shocker. It's going to be a game changer.
My sister, who's been teaching anthropology and an energy course at Berkeley for years, she put out this collection of articles several years ago in an Energy Reader, it's called. She marvels at how the people who have really got the science, engineering, the renewability down pat have been marginalized by advisory committees in the government. I know you've been on one or two, and there is still a dominant propaganda force here in this country behind nuclear and fossil fuels. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Well, there are trillions invested, and they don't want to give it up. As, by the way, when we were moving to cellular, the AT&T and the Ma Bells used to say cellular was a whim, who in a country with 99.7% quality service would spend 15 times more for a unit of communication. By the way, everybody. And so we have that same nonsense going in now because they've made these investments and they don't want to change. But now that we've scaled up and now that we have this kind of multi-million person employment and rising faster than fossil or nuclear, and now that we have states and cities saying we're going 100%, I don't see how they can win this no matter what shenanigans they do.
Tell us about cogeneration, waste heat from buildings being recycled. Is that quantitatively significant?
Huge. It could mean about 8% of the United States energy supply. And by the way, I want to point out 8% doesn't sound big, but 8% in the United States is all but 7 countries in the world. So that's a lot of energy. We have waste heat coming out of industrial processes that can be used to generate electricity. We can have waste heat coming out of air conditioners and commercial industrial absorption cooling systems that can heat water and give space heat. We have a large amount in an industrialized country. I want you to think that most of our electricity on this planet is creating heat, nuclear fission, coal, oil, gas, to create steam, to generate a steam turbine. Well, we have lots of processes that create heat that we can create steam and turn a steam turbine without using any of that stuff. And we can recycle the heat into either heating or cooling in buildings. So that is really what this is all about. We have the technology. We have an amazing set of companies, over 150 of them, with various technologies and management equipment. And the issue is it could have significant savings, therefore money-making. It's economic, and the environmental impacts are also huge.
Listeners should know that 8% of our total energy supply by cogeneration is more than the amount of energy from the entire nuclear industry, because they just have 20% of electricity. It's less than just recycling waste heat, as Scott Sklar has just pointed out. One last question that is often raised by the antagonists to what we're talking about, renewables and efficiency. Oh, well, all this wind power, solar, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing without taxpayer subsidies. As if fossil fuels and nuclear power don't have massive, historic, decade after decade subsidy. Well, how would you reply? Is there a time when they're going to be able to shed these subsidies?
Yes, but here's the deal. This is the game that's being played. We subsidize fossil at over $70 billion a year in taxpayer money. Nuclear, almost that much. Renewables are about $15 billion a year, and biofuels is about a little over $10 billion a year. So if you stop subsidizing the conventional old technologies that have enjoyed subsidies before we had a renewable industry, then all of a sudden you can ramp down and zero out these renewable subsidies. It would be like subsidizing dial phones at 80% and then hoping that the cellular industry could start. It would have never started. So we need to get rid of these subsidies, and it has to start with the conventional older industries first, and then you ramp down the renewable ones and actually create a competitive market. But again, we have the best Congress money can buy, and those industries don't want to lose their subsidies.
For sure. Tell our listeners in conclusion, Scott, how they can contact you and get more information for your many groups.
Well, first of all, I chair the Sustainable Energy Coalition in Washington, D.C., which is composed of the renewable and efficiency trade groups and think tanks and some of the environmental groups. So you can Google Sustainable Energy Coalition. My own company, the Stella Group, LTD.com. I have a whole range of reports and studies. And you can also email me at solarsklar@AOL.com, and I can send you the list of 33 studies I give my students and any other reports that you're interested in. The point being is the more we're informed and the more you inform your neighbors and the businesses you work for and your houses of worship, we will move to this transition that will benefit everybody, economically, for their health, and for their children and your grandchildren.
Well, I hope the corporate mass media will listen and give you and Paul Gunter and others more voice to reach tens of millions of people, because right now we see massive nuclear power advertisements on the radio, on TV, in newspapers, and we're not hearing the voices that reflect the giant acceleration of solar, wind, renewable, cogeneration. Thank you very much, Scott. To be continued. We've been listening to Scott Sklar, who is Mr. Solar Energy for over 40 years.
Ralph.
You must be very pleased. There have been so many false starts in solar over the years. You must be really pleased that it's now an unstoppable global renewable energy force.
Thank you for having me.
Very welcome, Scott.
I want to thank our guests today, Paul Gunter from Beyond Nuclear and Scott Sklar from the Stella Group. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. So welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we talked a little more with Ralph about solar energy, and we welcome back advocate for adjunct professors Maria Maesto to respond to a couple of listener questions and comments. And at the end, Ralph had something to say about how much it costs to keep Melania Trump and their son in New York City. First, let's continue our solar energy discussion.
Did this impress you? The data? It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Well, I'll tell you my own experience. My wife and I, we out here in California, we've had solar panels for about 15 years. And now our house is all electric. We pay a yearly electric bill of $150 a year. When we used to pay, at some months, we would pay $500 a month.
Well, why don't we
now
keep
pay $150 a year, and a lot of that is like administrative fees they tack on because they're not getting any money out of it. Southern California.
So you're all electric solar?
We're all electric. Yeah, we don't have a gas line. That's just the way the house is built. So it's all electric, and we have panels on the roof, which means our yearly energy bill for the whole house, everything we do in the house, $150.
Oh my! How much did it cost you to put it in that mode?
Well, back then, 15 years ago, it was, fortunately we were in a position to put out the capital outlay. I think the initial cost was $40,000. There was a $20,000 rebate, so it became to $20,000.
Oh my God!
But that was 15 years ago. That was more than 15 years ago. Like 16,
it would be
17.
more now?
I think it would be less now, I would think. So I don't know if, we've gotten that all back yet, but I'm sure.
You don't have a winter, of course, either. But
we don't have a winter. No, but we have a very hot summer. I mean, we don't have air conditioning. That probably helps.
Oh, yeah.
The house is cooler, but that, I can speak personally to the solar question there, at least in our case.
But the growth in employment is what is stunning compared to fossil and nuclear. And and we got a madman in charge of energy policy in the White House. I mean, this is like, where is this, like Transylvania somewhere or something?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the energy budget in the paper today, It's totally insane, literally, clinically insane. It's killing people and killing budgets when the solutions are all around us growing.
Right. Right. And it's what, 30, cutting the EPA by a third, Superfund by a third. It's
But you see, these guys, nobody debates there. They're all afraid to debate these guys, like Amory Lovins, and they don't get debated. And as a result, the static doesn't produce it. It doesn't move into the electoral campaign. So you see Democrat, Republican fighting each other for Congress seats. They don't talk about this.
Yeah. Now let's hear from Maria Mesto, who responded to some listener feedback. So Maria, on our show, you told us, quote, about 71% of all faculty in higher education are basically temporary workers. And we got a couple of responses to that. And the first one was from a gentleman named Martin Buck. And he asked very simply, where is all that tuition money going?
Yeah, so Martin is asking a really important question. And what I would say is that he should be asking it of college administrations and boards of trustees and state legislatures, because we all have a right to know where the tuition is going, and we have a right to have a say in where it should be going. What are the priorities? Are the priorities luxury dorms and athletic facilities and corporate salaries for college presidents? Or should the priority be supporting the faculty and staff who are there to fulfill the educational mission of the institution and to serve the students, which is purportedly the reason that the institution exists? So I think the more that we all can ask that question of the people who actually need to answer, I think the more we'll start to affect change.
And a gentleman named August Renfro, off of that same quote, asks, well, actually he doesn't ask. He has a little bit of a different take. He says, hey, this only reflects the larger economy. Why should these people be immune to the shifts in the larger economy? If they are, quote, teaching against this, they are ineffective. This is not a strong case for more tenure or higher pay.
Okay, well, number one, I think August is right that this is a reflection of what's happening in the larger economy, but I also think he's misunderstanding a key point that I was making. So we're not asking to be immune to the shift to a temporary workforce. We're joining with the vast majority of the members of the workforce, from lawyers and nurses to fast food workers and custodians, who are now recognizing that this shift is not helping the economy or the workforce, but undermining them. And we're joining with those workers to challenge the idea that this kind of precarious work is good for workers or for communities. So in the case of adjunct faculty, plenty of research shows that students also suffer from the effects of having professors who don't get the institutional support that they need to do their job. So, for example, that institutional support includes compensation that shouldn't have to be supplemented by public assistance or family members, and due process, to speak to his point about tenure, because tenure is really due process so that you can't be fired except for cause. So if you wouldn't take your kids to a doctor who had to work in a hallway and didn't have access to the medical equipment or colleagues that they need to consult in order to provide the best care, even if that doctor is the best in the world, why would you force that doctor to work in such terrible conditions? So if you wouldn't stand for this in fields like medicine, then why would you agree to it in higher education or in building safety or food service? Why would you go along with making working conditions as onerous as possible rather than supporting the people who actually do the work? So I think his question is really about the gig economy, and those who are selling the gig economy as new freedom and self-determination for workers are overlooking, I think, the fact that unless gig workers organize and advocate, then they're just temps and exploited temps at best.
Well, thank you, August and Martin, for those comments, and thank you, Maria Mesto, for coming back on and responding.
It was my pleasure. Thanks.
And now we're really going to wrap it all up with Ralph's comments about the cost of the Trump family to taxpayers. And you also wanted to, we're reading about the cost to New York City of keeping the Trump family in Trump Tower.
Well, according to the New York Times, it costs anywhere from $127,000 to $140,000 a day to provide security for Melania Trump and her son, Barron. And the question is, when are they going to go down to the White House and live in the White House with Donald Trump to save that enormous taxpayer bill?
Yeah.
Half that money is spent just keeping Donald away from Melania to protect.
That's right. I think. Yeah.
But it is a stunning figure, and it's just outrageous. Like it wouldn't exist, if they lived like, past presidents and families, they live in the White House.
The Secret Service travels with the idiot kids
on their business trips all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be more of an issue. Like they spent $80,000 just to travel with Donald Trump Jr. to Argentina, who's negotiating a business deal. We're seeing stuff that nobody could have imagined in their wildest nightmares a few years ago.
For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org.
For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
If you're interested in visiting the Tort Museum this summer, please see tortmuseum.org. Please go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky. Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll talk to you then, Ralph.
Thank you very much, David, Steve, and Jimmy. It's about time we get more publicity for good energy news.